The year is 1821. Imagine a world covered in the soot of the Industrial Revolution. London is a city of thick fog, horse-drawn carriages, and men in top hats chasing the next big fortune. The British Empire is expanding, and everyone, from wealthy bankers to humble cobblers, is looking for a piece of the new world. But in the dimly lit corners of London's most elite clubs, a man is preparing to sell something that doesn't exist. Not a house, not a company, but an entire nation. Enter Gregor MacGregor, a man whose name sounds as bold as his ambitions. He walks with the posture of a hero, his chest decorated with medals from the South American Wars of Independence. He claims to be a general, a friend of the great liberator Simón Bolívar. But MacGregor has a new title now, one that turns heads wherever he goes, the Cacique of Poyais, the prince of a sovereign state in the heart of the Black River on the Mosquito Coast. His story is intoxicating. He tells of a land called Poyais, a tropical utopia spanning 8 million acres. According to MacGregor, the climate is so perfect that it feels like eternal spring. The soil is so rich that you can plant a seed and watch it grow overnight. The rivers, they aren't filled with mud, but with chunks of pure gold reflecting the Caribbean sun. To a Londoner living in the grey cold smog, Poyais sounded like the Garden of Eden, and MacGregor, he was the man holding the keys to the gate. But how do you prove a country exists? MacGregor was a master of detail. He didn't just tell stories, he created a reality. He released a 350-page guidebook titled A Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, written by a mysterious Captain Thomas Strangeways. The book described the capital city, St. Joseph, with its grand boulevards, a theatre and a bank. He opened a Poyaisian legation in the heart of London. He even began printing Poyaisian dollar bills, complete with intricate designs and his own signature. He wasn't just lying, he was world-building. The trap worked. MacGregor began selling land grants for 3 shillings and 3 pence per acre, a fortune in those days. People didn't just invest their money, they invested their lives. Doctors, lawyers, and war veterans, men who had seen the world, fell for the charm of the prince. They traded their hard-earned British pounds for MacGregor's colorful, worthless Poyaisian paper. They believed they were the lucky ones, the pioneers of a new empire. By September 1822, the first ship, the Honduras packet, sat in the London docks, its sails fluttering in the wind. 70 passengers stood on the deck, waving goodbye to their families, clutching their Poyaisian land deeds like golden tickets. They were sailing towards a dream of mansions and luxury. As the ship faded into the Atlantic mist, Gregor MacGregor stood on the shore, watching them go. He knew the truth. There was no St. Joseph. There were no golden rivers. There was only a deadly, untouched jungle waiting to swallow them whole. The greatest scam in history had just set sail.
After weeks of staring at the endless blue of the Atlantic, the passengers of the Honduras packet finally saw land. They stood on the deck, clutching their Poyaisian land deeds, expecting to see the white sand beaches and the grand stone buildings of St. Joseph. But as the fog cleared, their hearts sank. There was no city. There were no ports. There was only the thick, suffocating wall of a swampy, prehistoric jungle. This was the Mosquito Coast, a place where even the trees seemed to scream, "Go back." But for these 70 souls, there was no going back. Confused and terrified, they stepped into the knee-deep mud, still wearing their fine London suits and silk dresses. They wandered into the trees, calling out for the officials Gregor MacGregor had promised would meet them. They found nothing but the deafening buzz of millions of mosquitoes. They searched for the Grand Theatre and the bank they had read about in MacGregor's book. Instead, they found two abandoned, half-rotten wooden huts sinking into the swamp. The truth was starting to settle in like a cold fever. St. Joseph was a ghost city that never existed. Reality became a nightmare. These people were bankers, tailors, and clerks, men and women who had never spent a night in the wild. They tried to build shelters, but the tropical rains were relentless, turning their campsite into a graveyard of mud. Their British clothes rotted off their bodies within days. When they tried to buy food from the local natives, they faced a final cruel joke. The natives wanted real gold or British pounds. They laughed at the colorful Poyaisian dollars MacGregor had given them. In this jungle, their life savings were nothing more than worthless scrap paper. Then came the real terror. It wasn't the jaguars or the snakes, it was the air itself. Yellow fever and malaria began to sweep through the camp. The strongest men were reduced to shivering wrecks within hours. With no medicine and no clean water, the settlers began to die. The sound of hammers hitting nails into makeshift coffins became the only rhythm of their lives. Among them was a young mother holding her child, watching as her husband was buried in a shallow, watery grave. The paradise they were sold had become a mass grave. Just as the survivors reached the brink of total madness, another ship appeared on the horizon, the Kennersley Castle. For a moment, they thought they were saved, but as the ship got closer, they realized the horror was only beginning. The ship was carrying 160 more victims, families just like them, cheering and waving from the deck, completely unaware that they were sailing into a trap. And back in London, Gregor MacGregor was already counting the money from his next set of victims. The tragedy was about to double, and the ocean was the only witness. Sun over the Mosquito Coast is no longer a source of life. It is a blinding, relentless furnace. The survivors of the Honduras packet and the Kennersley Castle have stopped looking at the horizon for help. They have stopped talking about the gold. They have even stopped crying. Their bodies are skeletal, their skin a map of sun-scorched sores and insect bites. Of the 250 hopeful souls who sailed from the docks of London, nearly 2/3 are now gone. They aren't just buried in the mud, they are forgotten in a land that was never meant to be theirs. The dream of Poyais has officially become a mass grave, and the only sound left is the rhythmic thud of wooden shovels hitting the wet, heavy earth. But in the middle of this living nightmare, one man refused to surrender to the jungle, Captain Marshall. He looked at the hollow eyes of the women and the shivering bodies of the children and realized a terrifying truth. If they stayed here one more week, the jungle would swallow everyone. He proposed a plan that sounded like madness, a suicide mission. They took one of the ship's small, rotting longboats. It was a fragile wooden shell, never built for the violent currents of the open Atlantic. But with shaking hands, they patched the holes using tattered clothes and hope. As Marshall and his small crew pushed that boat into the crashing surf, the entire camp stood on the shore in a haunting, ghostly silence. They knew that if this boat sank, every single person in Poyais was already dead. For 3 days and 3 nights, Marshall and his men fought the ocean. They had no fresh water, only the salt spray that burned their cracked lips. The heat was a physical weight, and their tongues swelled until they could no longer speak. Beneath their fragile boat, shadows moved, massive sharks circling, waiting for the moment the rotting wood would finally give way. Every wave was a mountain they had to climb, and every sunset felt like their last. But on the dawn of the 4th day, through a haze of salt and fever, a miracle appeared. A silhouette of a massive merchant ship, the Ocean, was cutting through the morning mist. When the crew of the Ocean looked down at the tiny rowboat, they didn't see sailors. They saw skeletal ghosts, caked in salt, staring back with eyes that had seen the end of the world. The captain of the Ocean, General Hall, listened to their story in absolute horror. A fake country? A fake prince? Hundreds of British citizens dying in a swamp? It sounded like a fever dream, but the breathing corpses in front of him were proof enough. He immediately turned his ship toward the Mosquito Coast. But when the Ocean anchored near the shore, a new tragedy began. The ship was a cargo vessel. It had limited space and even less food. A selection had to be made, the kind of choice that breaks a man's soul. Husbands had to literally peel their wives and children away, forcing them into the rescue boats while they stayed behind in the mud. The air was filled with a chorus of screams and sobbing that echoed against the silent, dark wall of the jungle. It was a rescue, yes, but it felt like a funeral. As the Ocean finally turned its back on the Mosquito Coast, the survivors stood on the deck, watching their paradise disappear into the fog. They left behind their life savings, their health, and the bodies of their loved ones. But as the physical pain began to fade, a new, colder sensation.
The journey back to civilization was not a victory lap. It was a floating graveyard. The survivors on the merchant ship Ocean were barely alive. Their bodies were skeletal, ravaged by yellow fever and months of starvation. Every day they stared at the endless gray water of the Atlantic, wondering if they would ever see the smog-filled skies of London again. But as the British coastline finally appeared through the fog, a new fear gripped their hearts. Who would believe their impossible story? How could one man, a highly decorated general, pull off such a monstrous, deadly lie? When the first survivors finally stepped onto the busy London docks, the city was completely unprepared for what they saw. These weren't the hopeful pioneers who had sailed away with dreams of gold and land. They were skeletal ghosts, dressed in tattered rags, their eyes hollow with a horror that words could not describe. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire through the coffee houses, the banks, and the newspaper offices. The paradise of Poyais was a sham. The prince was a murderous con man. The entire British Empire had been fooled by a single man with a beautiful map and a printing press. The anger in London was immediate and violent. Families of the dead demanded justice. The powerful bankers who had invested thousands were furious and embarrassed. The government was deeply humiliated on the world stage. A warrant was immediately issued for the arrest of Gregor MacGregor, the self-proclaimed cacique of Poyais. But when the police arrived at his lavish mansion in one of London's most elite squares, they found the doors locked and the rooms empty. MacGregor, the prince, had vanished into thin air, just like his fictional country. The hunt for the most dangerous con artist in history had begun. But MacGregor was always one step ahead. While London was burning with rage, he was already miles away, crossing the English Channel under a fake identity.
He knew that the news of his deadly scam would take weeks, maybe months, to reach Paris. He arrived in Paris not as a hunted criminal, but as a rich, mysterious nobleman in exile. He set up a new life, rented a grand apartment, and started presenting himself as a friendly general with a fantastic investment opportunity in a land called Poyais. He had escaped the noose in England, but he was about to play an even deadlier game in a new country. This is where the story goes from a crime to pure madness. In Paris, MacGregor didn't just hide, he didn't change his name. He opened a new Poyaisan legation and started the exact same scam all over again. He found new French investors, new bankers, and new victims. He began planning a third expedition to the deadly malaria-infested swamps of the Mosquito Coast. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just of the people who had already died for his lie, but of truth itself. Gregor MacGregor was not just a thief, he was a master manipulator who actually believed his own lie. But this time, the world was watching.
Gregor MacGregor thought he was untouchable. He had successfully launched the Poyais scam for the third time, collecting thousands of francs from French investors who dreamed of tropical riches. But the world was getting smaller. The news of the graveyard in the jungle had finally crossed the English Channel. French officials, more suspicious than the British, noticed something strange. Hundreds of people were applying for passports to a country that didn't appear on any official government map. They launched an investigation, and the house of cards began to wobble. For the first time in his life, the Prince of Poyais was cornered. In 1826, the law finally caught up with him. MacGregor was arrested and thrown into a cold French prison. The trial was a global sensation. Survivors from London sent letters, bankers testified, and the world watched as the man who sold a paradise stood in a cage. But MacGregor was a master manipulator until the very end. He used his charisma and legal technicalities to blame his associates. In a shocking twist that outraged the survivors, he was acquitted, found not guilty. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, but he was a man without a country, without a home, and soon without his stolen fortune. But the real damage of Poyais wasn't just the lives lost, it was the scar it left on the world's economy. The Poyais scam contributed to the Panic of 1825, one of the first major global financial crashes. People lost faith in international markets and emerging nations. For decades, investors were terrified to put money into Central and South America, stalling the growth of real countries because of one man's fake one. Gregor MacGregor didn't just kill settlers, he killed the trust that holds the global financial world together. The name Poyais became a curse word in the banks of London, Paris, and New York. MacGregor eventually fled to Venezuela, a country he had actually fought for in his youth. He died there in 1845, forgotten and broke. He was buried with full military honors, a final lie for a man whose entire life was a performance. Today, if you go to the Mosquito Coast in Honduras, you won't find the grand boulevards of St. Joseph or the Prince's Palace. You will only find the same thick, silent jungle and the same muddy banks. There is no monument to the hundreds of British souls who died for a piece of paper. The jungle has reclaimed everything, leaving only a haunting lesson about the deadly power of a well-told lie. The story of Poyais remains the most audacious scam in history. It reminds us that greed can blind even the smartest people, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword or a gun, it's a map and a promise. Gregor MacGregor sold a dream, but he delivered a nightmare.
And as we look at the world today, we have to ask ourselves, are we still buying tickets to Poyais? This was the story of the country that never was. Thank you for watching this 5-part journey into the heart of the greatest con ever pulled.